Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving into a really complex and, frankly, fascinating text, Dialogues from a Frozen Consciousness. Now, at first glance, it looks like a chaotic jumble of voices and poetic bits and pieces. But our goal today, it's to find the method in that madness. So to get our heads around this, let's just start with a thought experiment. What if every single part of you, your confidence, your deep-seated fears, your philosophical questions, those moments of total despair and, totally irrational hope, what if they were all given a voice at the same time? What would that chorus even sound like? Well, that's exactly the world we're stepping into. All right, so here is the key idea for our entire analysis today. We're not looking at these as separate characters in a story, no. I want you to think of them as a chorus of voices inside one single mind, each one representing a different piece of a fractured personality. That's the lens we're going to use to make sense of all this. Okay, so here's our roadmap. First, we're going to really establish this idea of an internal chorus. Then, we'll dig into three huge themes: the psychology of power, the very shaky fabric of reality, and the anatomy of despair. And finally, we'll pull it all together to figure out what a frozen consciousness actually is. First things first, we gotta meet the voices. And as we go, just remember, these aren't people, they're perspectives. They don't really talk to each other to move a story along. It's more like they talk past each other. It really shows you how stuck and unchanging this inner world is. So, let's kick things off with one of the most basic conflicts you can have, the struggle for power and control. We see two totally different parts of this consciousness wrestling with what it means to be strong, and wow, their approaches could not be more different. First up, we hear from a voice that calls itself the Viking. Now, this isn't some guy in a horned helmet. It's the personification of ancient raw brutality that's just adapted for our modern world. It basically argues that real power never went away, it just got more efficient. And now we call that sanitized cruelty civilized. It's a really chillingly honest take. And this worldview is so interesting because it really gets into the psychology of control. For this Viking part of the mind, power is all about perception. It knows its strength depends on everybody else's delusion that they're safe, that, it would never happen to them. This is the part of the consciousness that gets cold, strategic, institutional violence. It's pragmatic, and it has absolutely zero remorse. And then you have this voice, Elf 2. This is the complete other side of the power coin. This isn't about real, actual brutality. It's about the performance of strength. It brags about being psychologically nigh invincible, but then right away it kind of gives the game away, admitting that its physical strength is, well, another matter. And putting them side by side just perfectly illustrates the internal conflict here. Elf 2's bravado is so fragile. It admits it might just be a lot of bluster, and then it just spirals into hopelessness. The Viking, on the other hand, stays cold, consistent, totally in control. What we're seeing is a mind that's torn between a fantasy of being powerful and the cynical, brutal reality of what power actually is. Okay, so let's move on to our next theme, and you'll see how this all starts to connect. If this consciousness is conflicted about its own power, well, it's even more confused about its own reality. We have several voices that are genuinely questioning if they're real, if they're in a dream, or something else entirely. And this is where we meet Cottontail, who might just be the most self-aware voice in the whole text. It straight up confronts the idea that it might be a hallucination or even just a character in a story. This isn't just, existential angst. This is a total breakdown of the line between fiction and reality. And this brings us to a really cool literary concept, meta-narrative. Cottontail is basically a meta-narrative device. It's the part of the mind that suspects it's trapped inside a book, which means our analysis of the work is actually a theme inside the work itself. Pretty mind-bending, right? And Cottontail isn't alone. We also have the Explorer, a voice that feels like the personification of dissociation. It talks about being lost between realms, feeling this existential knife cut that separates it from everything. This is the part of the mind where what's going on inside feels so loud and overwhelming that the outside world just seems distant, less real. So let's recap. We have a consciousness obsessed with power, and it's also detached from reality. So what does that feel like? Well, our next section dives right into the emotional core, and it is a violent swing between pure poetic despair and a fragile, almost childlike hope. Enter the cauldron. Its voice is just pure, dark poetry. It is the voice of absolute nihilism. It argues that life is meaningless, that all our struggles are just manufactured for someone else's profit, and that the only logical conclusion is to just end it. It's the embodiment of complete and utter hopelessness. And just to be clear, nihilism isn't just being sad. It's a whole philosophical stance. It's the belief that life itself has no built-in value. The cauldron represents that intellectual, argumentative side of despair. And then in the other corner, you have Elf 3. This voice is the polar opposite. It's just pure, unadulterated, almost willfully stubborn optimism. It calls itself the definition of effervescence. But here's the kicker. It admits that its optimism might not make sense. That pessimism, yeah, it does seem to parallel reality more often. And this comparison just lays the whole emotional war bare. This consciousness is trapped. On one side, a part of it sees life as a meaningless puddle of pain. On the other, a part clings to the idea that life is marvelous, even when it suspects that's not true. There is no middle ground here, just these two warring extremes forever. Okay, so we've met the voices, we've looked at their battles over power, reality, and hope. So what does it all mean? What does it all add up to? The big question, what is a frozen consciousness? Well, the clue actually comes from a surprising place, our little optimist, Elf 3. In this one moment of pure insight, it asks if this consciousness could be alive, yet frozen in time. And that's not just a throwaway line. That is the key that unlocks this entire text. So here it is. This is our synthesis. A frozen consciousness is a state of being trapped. The voices are stuck on repeat. The fight between the Viking's brutality and Elf 2's bluster, it never goes anywhere. The detachment of Cottontail and the Explorer, it never finds its footing. And that war between the Cauldron's despair and Elf 3's hope, it's a permanent stalemate. This is a mind that is thinking, feeling, suffering, but it is completely, utterly incapable of moving forward. Cottontail gives us this final, haunting summary. It's a reality where anything seems possible. You've got talking cauldrons, time-traveling Vikings, you name it. But the one thing that isn't possible is change. Free will is just an illusion. This consciousness can re-examine its own pain endlessly, but it can never, ever escape it. And that leaves us with one final, kind of provocative thought. We've been analyzing these voices as parts of some fictional mind, right? But they hit home because they're really just extreme versions of our own inner monologues. So as you think about all this, maybe ask yourself, in the complex, sometimes chaotic chorus of your own consciousness, which voice, right now, is speaking the loudest?